Greetings, gaming citizens. Mike here. Over the past 5 years of making videos, I realized that there's a need for a massive, sizable change in my content delivery style. It's time for a remake. Greetings, gaming citizens. Mike here. You might be wondering what came out of this remake of my content. If you look closely, you'll see that I give 2% less of a shit about everything. Sometimes, a game releases, and that's it. Sure, you may have some games that offer DLC after launch, but for the most part, games just come out and we play them. It's one of our fundamental human rights after all. As time passes, games come out, and we play those. But at times, we'll look back on the classics that we enjoyed and wish we could bring those memories to the new hardware that we have. Maybe you grew up with Earthbound on the SNES back in the day, but when you play it on Nintendo Switch Online, you can't help but wonder if this game could be so much more with modern technology. Game development technology has steadily been improving over the past few decades. Gone are the days of simply using polygons being the hip new thing. Now AAA developers are all about making the most visually impressive experiences possible. And with that, we start to ask questions about how older games can be resurrected. Anytime I hear people talk about SNES games, almost every time the conversation will shift to, what if we put something like Super Mario RPG on the Octopath engine? Or generally speaking, you'll hear people ask questions like, what if we put this game in the style of this one? Or to quote my video on post-launch DLC, what if we make the people who bought this game buy it again? Look no further than profiting off nostalgia, aka remakes. Okay, maybe that's a bit harsh, albeit accurate from a business standpoint. Some remakes genuinely do stand out as incredible recreations of older games. But then sometimes you have those remakes that make you wonder what was even the point. Today, we'll be exploring just that. Remakes that transform the original game for modern audiences, as well as remakes that were released to less favorable reception. To be clear, this is by no means an exhaustive list or anything of that nature. I just picked a few examples of remakes, both good and bad, to talk about and evaluate their effectiveness in reinforcing nostalgia and how transformative the game is compared to its source material. If you have some remakes you personally enjoyed or disliked that I didn't talk about, let me know in the comments down below. Starting with the high performers, Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of the most anticipated remakes ever. For years, fans wanted to see this game fleshed out in full 3D and reach its absolute potential as it was a common favorite in the series. It wasn't until E3 2005 that fans were greeted with a remake. It was just a tech demo of the Final Fantasy VII intro cinematic, remade in Square's then new game engine. Obviously, this was to show off how powerful the PS3 was and what it could produce, but to hear it was only a tech demo was a real bummer for many fans. So how did we eventually get this game? Tetsuya Nomura said people were getting old. More specifically, the original producers of Final Fantasy VII have toyed around with the idea of a remake several times, but it was only in 2015 that they decided to start officially working on a remake because if they kept waiting, they eventually wouldn't be around to do it. I think it's safe to say all that effort paid off with how incredible the visuals are. For a game that was made to create more popularity for the PS4, this most certainly got the job done. That's not to say it didn't have any setbacks, though. While the title would make you logically expect it to just be the original story with high-definition visuals, Final Fantasy VII Remake is instead an alternate take on the story where Sephiroth goes back in time to mess with stuff. There were also some changes made due to changing social norms, as it had been over 20 years since the original came out. While it was unknown why these changes were made, it was stated by co-producer Yoshinori Kitase that the lore from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII was present and canon in Remake. For those not in the know, compilation of Final Fantasy VII is a sub-series of games, animated features, and short stories surrounding the world of Final Fantasy VII specifically. This includes Crisis Core, Ever Crisis, Advent Children, and so on. I sure can't wait to get my hands on the next entry, Final Fantasy VII Midlife Crisis. Another point of contention was how this game would release. In a blog post on Square Enix's website from December 2015, Kitase-san acknowledged the feedback regarding why Final Fantasy VII Remake would be several parts. He said the following in the blog post: "If we were to try to fit everything from the original into one remake installment, we would have to cut various parts and create a condensed version of Final Fantasy VII. This makes perfect sense to me. The world of Final Fantasy VII is quite ambitious, especially when combined with the creative vision of the remake. Making only Part 1 available on PlayStation 4 still kinda sucks though. Yeah, Part 1 is also available on PlayStation 5, but if you're like me and can't exactly upgrade to a PS5 right now, especially with the ongoing stock shortage, it kind of screws the eye of experiencing the game in its entirety. I'm sure this was a tough decision, mainly because they wanted to put every ounce of effort into making this as ambitious as possible. Still, it sucks that people like me won't be able to continue the story until we buy a PS5, which depending on your financial state could be a very long time from now. While we're talking about making the jump to PS5, it's worth mentioning the remake of Demon's Souls by Bluepoint. They already have a good reputation from the Shadow of the Colossus remake, but the Demon's Souls remake is visually stunning. This right here is the definition of a remake. Not just built from the ground up, but using the original game as a blueprint. Everything from the core gameplay to the music and quality of life improvements like making healing grasses have weight in your inventory. Wait a second. Bluepoint, Blueprint. I think these guys were born to do remakes. I can't really say much about this game since I've never played a Souls-like, but I can absolutely respect the ambition and commitment to making it not only familiar to veteran players, but creating a breathtaking experience for new players too. While we're still talking about gold examples of remakes, look no further than Resident Evil. The series has had an excellent track record for remakes, with the first game being remade for GameCube in 2002. While jumping from N64 to GameCube is undoubtedly quite a feat on its own, especially for the time, Resident Evil 2 Remake came out a whole 21 years after the original game was released. Granted, it wasn't supposed to take that long for Resident Evil 2 Remake to come out. It was actually being considered right after the remake of the first game came out, but then series producer Shinji Mikami instead wanted to focus on what would become Resident Evil 4. Considering how iconic that game turned out to be, I think that was the right move to make. 2's remake was impressive in how it was rebuilt, being remade in the RE engine that Capcom uses for most of its games today. In this engine, Capcom had to completely rework the gameplay by removing fixed camera angles, altering room layouts, and lighting to better conceal the enemies, and all around modernize the game for accessibility. To say this paid off is an understatement, as you'd be hard-pressed to find a review score below a 9 out of 10. It was so well-received that it was nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards. You know what else should have been nominated for Game of the Year? Katamari Damacy Reroll. Once again, this was a remake built from the ground up, but is quite literally a remake. As in, it is simply the game, remade with updated visuals. That said, I will call this an invisible remake, given how it wasn't really known that this was rebuilt from scratch. As far as people knew, it was just updated visuals, but Namco definitely tried to recreate this game entirely for modern platforms. While on the subject of games that remade the game visually, let's talk about Link's Awakening. In 2019, Nintendo remade The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, originally released on the Game Boy in 1993. I've gotta say, this remake is gorgeous. The claymation style is fantastic, and it just feels like a cute little world to run around and adventure in. My one gripe was that the game would sometimes have a poor frame rate in some areas, which is 100% a Nintendo Switch moment. Performance issues aside, I think this is a great example of a remake. Yes, they did use a completely new visual style, but otherwise, the core game remains the same. The world is the same as it was in the DX version for Game Boy Color, the music was remastered, and the controls were just as smooth as a portable Zelda could be. Continuing the topic of Zelda remakes, Nintendo made some excellent ones in the 3DS and Wii U era. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were both remade for the 3DS and were more than just updated graphics. In addition to adapting to the new control scheme of the 3DS, Ocarina of Time implemented mirrored versions of the dungeons from GameCube's Ocarina of Time Master Quest. For Majora's Mask 3D, there were significant quality of life improvements made to streamline the game experience. Besides technical stuff like making the game run at 30 FPS, Majora's Mask 3D made the Song of Double Time allow you to travel to any individual hour of the day instead of 6-hour intervals like the original. On top of that, the Bomber's Notebook was also reworked to be more in-depth regarding side quest details, rather than just giving you vague hints. A major change was the save system. As previously, you could only make a temporary restore point or fully save by resetting the 3-day cycle in the original game. In the 3DS remake, though, you can now save your data normally at any of the owl statues at any time. For the Wii U, Nintendo made sure the console was utilized as much as possible given how poorly it was selling. Wind Waker was given the HD treatment in 2013, and even by today's standards looks incredible. The updated lighting really did the cell shading justice. The gameplay was massively reworked to include gamepad features, such as your inventory being on the gamepad screen. This addition came as a result of being scrapped from Breath of the Wild's development, and it's a shame because in that game, this would have really come in handy. Aside from the gamepad compatibility, Wind Waker HD streamlined the infamous Triforce quest and introduced the Swift Sail for faster travel in the sea. Overall, great improvements. So much so that Nintendo decided to work on Twilight Princess HD not long after the release of Wind Waker. Yeah, when Wind Waker HD sold well, Nintendo realized that people like older games being made accessible on new hardware. Go figure, just like Wind Waker HD, Twilight Princess received a graphical upgrade and functionality with the Wii U gamepad. New additions and improvements include the reduction in tedious collecting for the Tears of Light in the Twilight realm, faster cutscenes, and a new dungeon called the Cave of Shadows that was only unlocked with the Wolf Link amiibo, which could only be gotten with special bundles of the game. I could go on about how I dislike meaningful game content being locked behind some form of a paywall, but I'll save that for another video. What I will say is, it's a shame we still haven't seen these games come to Switch since they were so vastly improved over the originals. We only have nearly every other Zelda game under the sun available on the system, so why bother, I guess. You know what else makes me wonder why bother? Remakes that come out only a few years after the original. Super Mario All-Stars is one of the better-known remakes out there, remaking Mario 1, 2, 3, and Lost Levels in the style of Super Mario World and bundling them all together on one cartridge. This is by no means a bad remake at all, but its existence is kinda strange when you think about it. Imagine your friend comes up to you and is like, "Dude, you know what I'm nostalgic for in 1993? Games that came out in 1985. That's so retro." Again, this isn't a bad remake in any capacity, but other than going from 8 to 16 bits and making Luigi look more than just like Green Mario, I just don't see the logic behind Nintendo releasing this when they did. Then again, this wouldn't be the last time we saw remakes of the first few Mario games, as we also had the Super Mario Advance series, which made these games portable for the first time. You know what series also gets remakes semi-often? Pokemon. Specifically, I want to talk about Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the Gen 4 remakes that were highly anticipated after 2014's Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Pokemon has historically done well with remakes up to this point, so when news of Gen 4 remakes broke out, everyone was naturally excited. Upon the reveal, however, fans were quickly divided over these games. Pokemon remakes are usually transformative by nature, adding all kinds of features and even new story content with the aforementioned Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's Delta episode. But with the release of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, we don't see many significant changes. Sure, the Grand Underground was reworked with modern online connectivity in mind, but otherwise stays completely faithful to the original games. As a Pokemon fan, this doesn't bother me personally, but a bit more modernization could have gone a long way. Also, keep in mind that these games came out after Sword and Shield, with Legends Arceus 2 months out. Both games had no random encounters and had Pokemon spawn in the overworld. Adding that would have been really nice, as this system was favored more by fans as opposed to spamming repels. Even the Gen 1 remakes, Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, had encounters that showed up in the overworld instead of random encounters. Why not these games? When talking more about modern gameplay changes, the art style was incredibly divisive upon reveal. Many, including myself, weren't on board with the chibi style for these remakes. While I did kind of adjust to it over time, it was still not a fantastic look in general. This is a situation where a remake that does too much of the bare minimum can be considered not good. I know I just talked about how games like Katamari Damacy Reroll did the bare minimum by just rebuilding the game in a modern graphical style, but this is a little different given how controversial the Gen 4 remakes were. Logically, because it's Pokemon of all things, the expectations were higher from the community. Speaking of graphical enhancements, that's another murky point I have about remakes, when graphics are not only one of the changes made, but are basically the entire focus of said remake. The Last of Us was released on the PS3 in 2013 and was universally praised by critics, receiving high marks across the board. In April 2014, however, a remaster of the game was announced for the then-new PlayStation 4 and slated for a summer release that year. I'm not going to pretend this remaster didn't add plenty of significant changes, because it certainly did. To start off with features that took advantage of the system itself, the remaster utilized a DualShock 4's controller to enhance the immersion of the game. This included compatibility with the touchpad for inventory navigation, audio recordings discovered in-game would play through the controller's speaker, and the light bars signaled the player's health, changing from green to orange to red when taking damage. The remaster also upgraded the rendering capabilities within the game, increased the frame rate, added advanced audio options, and included all previous DLC content. This is a good remaster. It improves the game's visual fidelity with the new hardware, has some neat features, and has more accessibility options, which in my eyes is always a good thing. The Last of Us Part 1 makes no fucking sense to me. On September 2nd, 2022, Naughty Dog released a remake of The Last of Us for PlayStation 5. This remake was built from the ground up and would take advantage of the PS5's hardware. Everything from the graphics to the AI received improvements, as well as added even more accessibility options. The DualSense controller gave this remake the capabilities of haptic feedback and adaptive triggers, and the game supported 3D audio, in addition to adding even more accessibility options, including audio descriptions for cutscenes. I get it. The Last of Us is incredibly popular and is one of the most well-known PlayStation IPs out there. But if you've already played the game on PS3 or PS4, you really have no reason to pick this remake up. Even if you wanted to make the argument that it would sell new players on a PS5, that wouldn't really work, because we still are having stock shortages of PS5 systems over 2 years after launch. Plus, it's much more affordable to just buy a used PS4 and a copy of the remaster, which usually goes for $10. Make no mistake, this is definitely an ambitious remake, but it's hard to recommend it because the PS4 remaster is just much easier to get your hands on. Yes, the accessibility options in the remake are fantastic, and I commend Naughty Dog for adding them, but making this remake cost $70 is a tough sell. From what I've talked about in this video, remakes and remasters are difficult to navigate. When a remake or remaster is announced, you'll get opinions from all points on the spectrum, ranging from "this abandons the original vision of the game" to "this is not different enough." From the visual style to the gameplay, it feels like every aspect of a remake is under more scrutiny than is necessary. Don't get me wrong, it's fine to have your own taste in games, but when you call Final Fantasy VII Remake a bad game because the gameplay isn't turn-based like the original, that's just not a good take. Whether you see remakes as profiting off nostalgia or reimaginings of beloved classics or whatever buzzwords they're throwing at us these days, they have their place in the gaming industry. It may sound like a big ask, but when a remake gets announced, we should be more open-minded to new ideas. Again, it's fine to have your own taste in games, but trying something different is zero risk. Worst case scenario, you don't enjoy the game and you pass the game on for $2 for store credit or something. Usually, at the end of these videos, I ask what your thoughts on the topic were, but I want to switch it up and encourage people to think more constructively. Don't worry, there's no risk in trying this idea out. What I want you to do is go into the comments down below and either tell me about a remake/remaster you enjoyed, or one you played that you didn't enjoy, and what could have made it more fun. Stay vibing and thriving, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.